The Celestial War College occupied a pocket dimension somewhere between the Andromeda Spiral and a particularly aggressive black hole, which seemed fitting for an institution dedicated to teaching 1,700 species how to kill each other more efficiently. For 8,000 years, the college had stood as the galaxy's premier military academy, a gleaming monument to the principle that violence, when performed with sufficient technique and philosophical justification, became art. The tuition alone could fund a small planetary terraforming project, but that was considered reasonable for an education in professional devastation. The college operated under a doctrine so fundamental it had been encoded into its quantum-locked charter. Biological superiority determines martial excellence. Every sentient species in the known galaxy had evolved some form of natural weaponry, from the Qualrix's molecular acid glands to the Dravine's ability to manifest solidified gravity wells from their neural cortex. The War College existed to refine these gifts, to transform evolutionary advantages into tactical dominance that could be deployed across any battlefield in the galaxy. What nobody had bothered to consider was what happened when a species showed up that evolution had apparently skipped entirely during the distribute cool weapons phase of development. This oversight was about to become a very expensive lesson in assumptions. Commandant Rix Thal observed the incoming transport shuttles from his observation tower, his 6 sensory stalks tracking each vessel with the precision of someone who had processed 40,000 incoming cadets over his career. He was Venthari, which meant his crystalline endoskeleton could project monomolecular cutting edges from any point on his body, and his respiratory system could generate neurotoxic gas clouds on command. He had personally trained 12 galactic champions and authored 9 volumes on the philosophy of biological combat superiority. He was about to experience the academic equivalent of a stress fracture. The human transport docked at Platform 7, and Rix Thal consulted his intake roster with mild interest. Humans were newcomers to galactic civilization, having achieved faster-than-light travel only a century and a half ago, which in galactic terms meant they had barely stopped setting their own ships on fire accidentally. Their admission to the War College had sparked heated debate among the faculty, primarily because nobody could identify what natural weapons humans possessed. The admissions committee had eventually concluded that humans must have some hidden biological advantage that their limited scientific documentation had simply failed to record properly. Perhaps they possessed latent psionic abilities, or maybe their cellular structure contained undiscovered combat applications. The committee approved their admission based on this assumption. The assumption was technically accurate in the most catastrophically misleading way possible. Nia Okafor emerged from the transport with the relaxed confidence of someone who had already survived a journey through space aboard what was essentially a repurposed cargo hauler. She stood at 175 centimeters, which made her unremarkably average among approximately 60% of galactic species. And she carried a single duffel bag containing personal effects. No armor casing, no weapon vault, no ceremonial evolutionary gifts passed down through genetic lineages. The intake processor, a Qualrix named Shenzora, whose acid glands pulsed with bioluminescent efficiency, examined her documentation with growing confusion. Cadet Okafor, human, where is your biological weapons declaration form? Did not fill one out, Nia said. Why not? Do not have biological weapons to declare. Shenzora's translator implant made a sound like a database, querying itself for context that did not exist. Every species possesses combat-applicable evolutionary traits. Enhanced musculature, regenerative capabilities, sensory advantages, structural weapons, chemical projection systems, energy manipulation. What is your species' natural armament? We sweat really effectively, Nia offered. and we can throw objects with impressive accuracy due to our shoulder joint configuration." The silence that followed was the kind typically reserved for moments just before someone realizes they have made a terrible administrative error. Shenzora cycled through her training protocols, found nothing applicable, and made a notation that would later be described by the faculty review board as aggressively inadequate. "Report to Intake Hall 3. We will determine your classification during orientation." The orientation ceremony took place in an amphitheater constructed from materials harvested from 17 different star systems, because apparently nothing said military excellence like excessive architectural budget. 3,000 cadets filled the space, representing the finest warriors their species could produce. Nia found herself seated between a Dravine, whose gravity well generation created a noticeable dip in the local space-time, and a Qualrix, whose acid glands occasionally dripped onto the floor with a hissing sound that suggested the cleaning staff earned their salaries. Dean Korvesh took the central platform, his Venthari form refracting the amphitheater's lighting into patterns that were probably meant to inspire martial fervor, but mostly just gave everyone a headache. He was old, even by Venthari standards, his crystalline structure bearing the fracture patterns of someone who had survived 300 years of combat training incidents. "Welcome to the Celestial War College," Korvesh began, his voice resonating through a dozen harmonic frequencies. "You represent the apex of your species' evolutionary combat potential. Each of you was selected because your biological gifts mark you as natural warriors." The speech continued for 57 minutes, covering everything from the college's glorious history of producing galactic military leaders to the philosophical importance of understanding how one's evolutionary advantages shaped tactical thinking. Nia spent the time studying the amphitheater's construction, noting that the support columns were decorative rather than load-bearing, the seating was modular and could be disassembled, and the floor panels showed stress marks suggesting they were replaceable sections rather than solid construction. "Now," Korvesh announced, "we proceed with the weapon registry ceremony. Each cadet will demonstrate their species' natural armament for official documentation." What followed was essentially evolution's highlight reel presented in order of destructive capability. A Dravine cadet generated a gravity well that crushed a test dummy into a sphere the size of a fist. A Qualrix demonstrated acid projection that dissolved a reinforced target in 4 seconds. A Krenthi cadet manifested bioplasma from specialized organs and melted a hole through a barrier wall. The demonstrations continued with retractable bone blades, electromagnetic pulses generated from neural tissue, pheromone clouds that induced paralysis, and one particularly memorable Zeth Call, who could apparently dislocate their entire skeletal structure and reform it into different configurations. "Cadet Okafor," Korvesh called, his sensory stalks focusing on her with the intensity of someone reviewing documentation they found personally offensive. "Demonstrate your species' natural weapon." Nia walked to the demonstration platform, stood in the center, and held up her empty hands. Humans do not have natural weapons. The amphitheater's response progressed through several stages. Confused silence, scattered laughter, then a general buzz of conversation that suggested 3,000 cadets were simultaneously reconsidering whether this was a serious military academy or an elaborate prank. Korvesh's crystalline form flickered through several colors that his species used to express complex emotions, settling on something the translation matrix identified as profound administrative irritation mixed with existential confusion. "Impossible," Korvesh stated. "Every species that achieves sentience develops combat-applicable evolutionary traits. It is a fundamental requirement of survival in a hostile universe." "We developed tool use instead," Nia said, "and cooperative social structures. Also endurance hunting, which is less impressive in demonstration format." More laughter. this time with an edge of derision. A Dravine in the upper seating made a comment in its native language that the translation system decided was too insulting to process, which was saying something given the system's usual tolerance for creative profanity. Corvesh made several notations on his holographic interface, each gesture emanating disappointment. Cadet Okafor will be classified as civilian observer status. Training protocols will be adjusted to account for her non-combatant designation. The way he said adjusted made it clear the adjustments would involve mostly theoretical coursework and probably a lot of sitting in the back of classrooms while real warriors trained. The first week confirmed Nia's suspicions about what adjusted protocols meant in practice. While other cadets engaged in combat simulations designed to enhance their natural abilities, she was assigned to courses with titles like Theoretical Combat Analysis for Non-Participants and Military History for Diplomatic Support Personnel. The instructors treated her with the polite detachment typically reserved for tourists who had somehow wandered into restricted military facilities and whom nobody wanted to explicitly expel because the paperwork would be annoying. Instructor Vek Ral, a Krenthi whose bioplasma generation had won him 17 combat championships, seemed particularly amused by her presence. During one memorable lecture on maximizing biological weapon efficiency, he called on her to explain how humans would theoretically approach combat without natural weapons. "We would use tools," Nia said. "Tools are not weapons," Vekral replied, with the confidence of someone who had never needed anything beyond his own biology. Weapons are extensions of the warrior's body, derived from evolutionary superiority. Tools are what civilians use. "Understood," Nia said, making a mental note that Krenthi bioplasma required approximately 2 seconds of charging time before projection, during which the user's defensive capabilities were reduced by an estimated 40%. Interesting vulnerability. The other cadets were less diplomatic about their opinions. A group of them, led by a Dravine named Throkval and including representatives from 5 different species, made it their personal mission to remind Nia that she did not belong in a military academy. They blocked her path in corridors, accidentally knocked her equipment off tables during theoretical exercises, and made increasingly creative observations about human fragility and the questionable judgment of the admissions committee. Nia endured this with the patience of someone who understood that predators grew bored when prey failed to provide entertaining reactions. She spent her free time exploring the college's facilities, running her hands along walls to test material composition, examining furniture construction, testing the weight distribution of various objects, and generally behaving like someone conducting a very thorough engineering survey that nobody had authorized. The maintenance staff assumed she was lost. The faculty assumed she was struggling to adapt to an environment designed for actual warriors. Both assumptions were partially correct and completely missed the actual situation developing. The practical assessment arrived in week 3, a surprise. Evaluation designed to test each cadet's ability to apply their natural weapons in dynamic combat scenarios. The course was a 3-dimensional maze of platforms, obstacles, and holographic opponents that adapted their tactics based on each participant's demonstrated abilities. Throkval went first, his gravity wells crushing holographic enemies and pulling obstacles out of his path with contemptuous ease. The Qualrix cadet melted through barriers with acid projection. The Krenthi vaporized targets with bioplasma. Each demonstration was a showcase of evolutionary advantages applied with trained precision. "Cadet Okafor," Instructor Vekaral announced. "Show us how humans theoretically survive combat situations without actual weapons." Nia entered the course, and for the first 40 seconds, every faculty member's low expectations appeared to be generously optimistic. She stumbled on a platform edge, nearly fell, caught herself on a support railing that bent under her grip. Then something shifted that would later require 3 separate faculty committees to analyze. She examined the bent railing, tested its flexibility with a few experimental tugs, and then wrenched it completely free from its mounting brackets. The railing became a pole approximately 2 meters long. She used it to vault over a barrier that other cadets had destroyed with their natural weapons. When a holographic opponent materialized behind her, she wedged the pole into a gap between platforms, creating an improvised lever that launched her upward to a higher level. The course continued. She used floor panels as makeshift shields, pried loose smaller support structures to use as climbing aids, turned a decorative barrier into a ramp by wedging it at an angle between 2 platforms. Every element of the carefully designed combat environment became a tool, a weapon, an advantage that the designers had never intended. She did not fight with the elegant brutality of species designed for combat. She fought like someone solving a series of engineering problems that occasionally required hitting holographic enemies with improvised objects. She completed the course ranked in the middle third of her class, which was respectable for someone the instructors had mentally classified as basically a civilian who accidentally enrolled in military academy. Instructor Vec Ral reviewed the recording 4 times, his bioplasma glands flickering with what his species expressed as nervous confusion. Environmental exploitation using unintended object applications. Crude, inefficient, but technically effective. Lucky, Throckval muttered, though his gravity well manipulation flickered uncertainly, suggesting he was not entirely convinced of his own assessment. The incident in the tactical analysis hall occurred on day 21, and in retrospect was probably inevitable, given the social dynamics that had been developing. Nia had just collected her datapad from the equipment station when Throckval and his multi-species alliance, 6 cadets representing the Academy's most arrogantly self-assured students, surrounded her in a formation that was clearly meant to be intimidating. "Human," Throckval said, his gravity manipulation creating a pressure gradient that made the air feel heavy. "You have embarrassed yourself and this institution long enough. Admit you are not warrior material and transfer to diplomatic services where you belong." Nia looked at the 6 cadets, then at the tactical analysis hall's layout. 30 training tables, each equipped with holographic projection equipment racks along the walls containing various training implements, structural support beams every 5 meters. The floor was reinforced composite with removable panels for maintenance access. The walls were lined with impact-resistant polymer that could withstand most biological weapons. "No," she said simply. Throckval's patience, never his defining characteristic, evaporated. He generated a gravity well aimed at her center mass, intending to pin her to the floor in a display of superior evolutionary advantage. Nia threw her datapad, not at Throckval, at the Qualrix standing to his left. The datapad hit the Qualrix's sensory cluster, and the cadet's reflexive flinch disrupted Throckval's concentration. The gravity well collapsed. Nia was already moving. She grabbed the edge of the nearest training table and flipped it, the reinforced surface becoming an improvised shield as a Krenthi's bioplasma blast splattered harmlessly against the composite material. She drove the table forward like a battering ram, catching the Krenthi in the midsection. The cadet doubled over, and Nia pivoted, swinging the table in a wide arc that scattered 2 more attackers. A Venthari cadet lunged from her right, monomolecular blades extending. She dropped the table, grabbed a training chair, and used it to pin the Venthari's blade arm against a support column. The chair's legs wedged into the column's maintenance panel, creating an improvised trap that the Venthari could not escape without retracting his blades. which would eliminate his offensive capability. Throckval recovered, circling her with renewed caution and significantly reduced confidence. "You cannot improvise forever, human. You have no real weapons." "Do not need them," Nia said, grabbing a holographic projector from the equipment rack. She activated it while simultaneously hurling it at the remaining Qualrics. The device projected a disorienting light pattern while in flight, and the Qualrics' visual processing system overloaded, causing the cadet to stumble directly into a storage cabinet. The fight lasted approximately 2 minutes and involved creative applications of training equipment, furniture components, holographic technology, and one particularly unfortunate incident involving a maintenance toolkit. When it ended, Nia stood in the center of a tactical analysis hall that looked like it had been hit by a localized equipment malfunction, surrounded by 6 groaning cadets who were experiencing several revelations simultaneously about assumptions and evolutionary superiority. Security personnel arrived to find her calmly straightening her uniform. "There was a disagreement about my enrollment status," she explained. The security footage review became a mandatory viewing for the entire senior faculty and lasted nearly 4 hours. 14 instructors, 3 deans, Commandant Rixthal, and one increasingly distressed facilities manager watched the recording from multiple angles while the room's atmosphere progressively shifted from confusion to concern to something approaching existential dread. "She violated no combat regulations," Dean Korvesh observed, his crystalline form flickering through colors that suggested intense cognitive dissonance. "Environmental weaponization is not prohibited because no species has ever required such a prohibition." "She turned a chair into a restraint system," Instructor Vekral said quietly, "and a datapad into a distraction weapon, and a holographic projector into both a projectile and a sensory attack simultaneously." Commandant Rixthal had spent the last 3 hours accessing human historical databases, and what he discovered had caused his sensory stalks to retract protectively. "Faculty," he said, with the careful tone of someone delivering catastrophically bad news, "I strongly suggest reviewing human military history. Specifically, their documented tendency to weaponize literally anything within reach during combat situations. The archives told a story that violated several principles the War College considered fundamental to military science. Humans had weaponized agricultural equipment, cooking implements, musical instruments, sporting goods, furniture, vehicles designed for peaceful transport, construction materials, and in one particularly disturbing historical incident that required 3 separate confirmations: a frozen aquatic animal. They had turned defensive fortifications into offensive weapons, used their own infrastructure as improvised armaments, and demonstrated what the research database clinically described as pathological inability to observe any object without immediately calculating combat applications. They evolved without natural weapons, Dean Korvesh said slowly, his voice resonating with horrified realization. So they developed the cognitive framework to turn everything else into weapons instead. This fundamentally changes our evaluation protocols, Rixthal decided. Place her in advanced combat assessment. If this ability is limited or situational, it will be exposed under rigorous testing. And if it is not limited? Vekral asked. Nobody answered, which was the most honest response available. The advanced combat evaluation took place in Arena 12, a holographic combat zone capable of simulating any environment and generating opponents calibrated precisely to each participant's demonstrated skill levels. Nia entered to find herself in a recreation of a standard military facility. Walls, floors, structural elements, and yes, furniture. including several heavy-duty administrative desks that the college used throughout its facilities. Her opponents materialized. 4 advanced cadets, each representing species with refined natural weapons and weeks of specialized training to maximize their evolutionary advantages. They were fast, skilled, experienced, and absolutely certain they were about to conclusively demonstrate that improvisation could not defeat proper biological superiority. They were about to discover that certainty and accuracy were different things. Nia walked directly to the nearest desk and placed both hands on its surface. The desk was constructed from titanium composite alloy, approximately 2.3 meters long, 1.1 meters wide, weighing roughly 215 kilograms. It was designed to be functionally indestructible, aesthetically appropriate for military administration, and completely stationary. It was not designed to be a weapon, which was about to become irrelevant. She examined the connection points where the legs attached to the surface. Standard magnetic coupling with reinforced fastening bolts. The desk's surface had a subtle convex curve for ergonomic purposes. The legs were hollow tubes with internal structural supports designed to distribute weight efficiently. Her opponents attacked simultaneously, which was tactically sound and completely useless. Nia gripped the desk's edge with both hands and pulled upward while simultaneously twisting. The magnetic couplings released with a metallic shriek. She continued the rotation, folding the desk's legs inward using leverage points that existed because she understood material stress physics, and the desk's designers had optimized for durability rather than resistance to deliberate structural manipulation. In approximately 5 seconds, she had transformed an administrative desk into a roughly L-shaped implement that functioned as a hammer on one end and a shield on the other. The first opponent, a dravine, launched a gravity well. Nia raised the desk shield, and the gravitational force dispersed across the metal surface without affecting her. She pivoted, bringing the hammer end down in an overhead arc that used the weapon's weight and gravity rather than her muscles. The dravine tried to dodge. 215 kilograms of metal moving with accumulated momentum did not care about dodging. The impact cratered the arena floor and eliminated the first opponent. The second opponent, a Krenthi, charged with bioplasma building in its projection glands. Nia used the desk weapon's shield end as a battering ram, catching the Krenthi mid-charge and sending the cadet sliding across the arena floor. She spun, using the weapon's weight to build rotational momentum, and struck the third opponent, a Venthari, with enough force to send the cadet tumbling into a holographic barrier wall. The fourth opponent, a Qualrix, attempted acid projection. Nika angled the desk shield, and the acid ran off the treated surface harmlessly. She advanced, using the weapon's weight and her understanding of physics to move it in ways that appeared impossible, but were simply applied leverage and momentum management. "How are you wielding that?" the Qualrix demanded. "It weighs over 200 kilograms. "Yes," Nia agreed. She was not holding the desk weapon aloft like some mythological hero with a legendary blade. She was resting it on the ground, using the floor to support its weight, moving it through space using leverage points and rotational physics rather than raw strength. "Want to try lifting it?" The Qualrix tried. The desk weapon remained stationary. "Leverage," Nia explained, bringing the weapon down again in an arc that the Qualrix barely evaded. Center of gravity. Understanding material stress points and how to exploit structural vulnerabilities. Humans have been moving objects heavier than ourselves since we discovered you could use a stick to lift a rock. We just kept refining the principle. The fight ended with 4 defeated opponents and 1 severely modified piece of furniture. Nia stood in the arena's center, breathing slightly harder than normal, but not exhausted, surrounded by destruction that should not have been possible for someone classified as a non-combatant. The observation deck was absolutely silent, except for the sound of Commandant Rixthal's sensory stalks retracting protectively. Dean Corvesh's crystalline form cycled through 23 colors before settling on a deep purple that the translation matrix hesitantly identified as existential crisis, with undertones of professional embarrassment. "Explain your technique," Corvesh demanded, his voice missing its usual harmonic confidence. Nia set down the desk weapon with the careful precision of someone handling volatile explosives, even though it was technically just furniture. Humans evolved on a planet that was actively hostile to our survival. No venom, no claws, no armor plating, no energy projection, no biological advantages whatsoever. We were slower than the predators, weaker than most prey animals, and our primary ecological niche was probably going to die. So we developed tool use and the cognitive framework to support it. We learned to see every object not as what it was, but as what it could become. She gestured at the modified desk. Rocks became hammers. Sticks became spears. Animal bones became knives. We turned the entire planet into an armory because evolution forgot to give us natural weapons. And then we developed technology, built civilizations, and achieved spaceflight. But we never lost that fundamental cognitive pattern. We still look at any object and immediately calculate how to break it, use it, or turn it into something that hurts our enemies. But surely that was primitive survival strategy, Instructor Vekaral protested. You have advanced technology now. Surely you have evolved beyond such crude methods. Nia smiled, and several faculty members instinctively took a step backward. Instructor, humans have fought wars with everything from sharpened rocks to weapons that can crack planets. The technology scale changed. The fundamental principle never did. Environmental weaponization is not a skill we learned. It is a survival strategy we cannot turn off, even when we probably should. The emergency faculty meeting lasted 7 hours and included heated debates about whether Nia had somehow violated the philosophical spirit of the War College's charter, despite following every literal regulation. The charter was consulted, specifically the section encoded in quantum-locked text. Biological superiority determines martial excellence. She has no biological weapons, one instructor argued. She has every weapon, another countered. That is precisely the problem we are facing. Commandant Rixthal made the final decision with the resigned authority of someone who knew this was going to become a historical footnote that future military scholars would analyze extensively. Cadet Okafor's methods are unorthodox, but technically compliant with all regulations. She will continue her training under a new classification. Should we not update the curriculum? Dean Corvesh asked. Other cadets are already attempting to replicate her techniques. They were, and the results ranged from ineffective to actively dangerous. Dravine cadets could not calculate leverage points while simultaneously managing gravity well generation. Krenthi found that bioplasma charging cycles made manipulating improvised weapons nearly impossible. The Venthari broke 6 chairs and injured themselves twice trying to replicate Nia's tactical analysis hall performance. The Qualrix accidentally melted 3 desks with nervous acid secretions. Environmental weaponization requires a specific cognitive framework, Instructor Vekaral reported after studying the failed attempts and consulting with the xenopsychology specialists. The practitioner must perceive objects as potential rather than purpose. It is not a technique that can be taught to species whose evolution provided actual biological weapons. Their neural pathways are optimized for maximizing natural advantages, not for seeing everything as potentially weaponizable. So we implement no curriculum changes? Korvesh asked. We reinforce the furniture, the facilities manager said with absolute firmness. Starting immediately with the cafeteria, then the training halls, then literally everything that is not welded to the floor or walls. 4 months into the academic term, Nia had become a legend that cadets discussed in hushed tones when they thought instructors were not listening. She was not the physically strongest student, nor the fastest, nor the most naturally gifted by any conventional measure. But she maintained a perfect record in combat evaluations, because every environment she entered immediately became her personal armory. The furniture was indeed reinforced and bolted down, which simply forced her to identify new improvisation opportunities. Support beams could be used as fulcrum points for lever-based attacks. Floor panels could be pried up in emergencies if one knew where the maintenance access points were located. Wall-mounted equipment could be repositioned with sufficient force applied at correct angles. Even the reinforcement bolts themselves could be weaponized if one possessed sufficient patience and understood rotational force dynamics. Unarmed had stopped being an insult or designation of weakness. It had become a warning label that other cadets learned to respect. Thrakval, demonstrating more adaptability than his initial behavior suggested, had learned extensively from their tactical analysis hall encounter. He now treated Nia with careful respect and maintained safe distance during joint training exercises. Several other cadets had begun studying human history, though their fascination seemed equally divided between academic interest and pure survival strategy. On graduation day, Dean Korvesh addressed the assembled cadets with his usual fondness for extended philosophical observations about martial excellence and evolutionary destiny. You came to the Celestial War College to refine the weapons evolution provided. You leave as masters of your natural gifts, prepared to serve your species with distinction. Nia stood among her graduating class, officially classified as Environmental Combat Specialist Grade Alpha, which was the college's bureaucratic method of admitting they had no idea what else to call someone who had systematically demolished every assumption they held about combat theory. The Celestial War College, Korvesh concluded, his voice carrying harmonic overtones of reluctant admiration, has spent 8,000 years teaching the galaxy's finest warriors how to perfect their evolutionary advantages. This year, we learned that evolution's most dangerous weapon might be the species that evolution apparently forgot to arm at all. After the ceremony, Commandant Rixthal found Nia examining one of the ceremonial pillars in the graduation hall with the focused attention of someone conducting an engineering assessment. Graduate Okafor, what are you doing? Noticing that these pillars are decorative rather than load-bearing, Nia observed. They could be toppled with approximately 60 kilograms of force applied at a 23-degree angle from vertical. And the material composition suggests they would fragment into approximately 12 large pieces upon impact, each of which could be weaponized. Why would you need to know that information? Nia smiled. Probably will not need it. But that is the fundamental thing about humans, Commandant. We prefer being prepared for situations that will probably never occur over being unprepared for situations that definitely will. Rixthal watched her walk away to join her fellow graduates, then looked at the ceremonial pillar with newfound suspicion and concern. He made a note to have facilities review the structural integrity and potential weaponization risk of all decorative elements throughout the college. Then he made a second note to investigate whether graduation certificates could be weaponized, because with humans, one could apparently never be too careful about objects that seemed harmless. The Celestial War College updated its quantum lock charter the following semester. Beneath the original text about biological superiority and evolutionary advantages, They added a new subsection in deliberately small print that read, "Exception Clause. Humans will weaponize anything. Everything." This is not hyperbole. This is documented fact. Reinforce your furniture and prepare for conceptual challenges to fundamental assumptions about combat theory. The admissions committee approved 5 additional human cadets for the next academic cycle, because apparently the faculty had decided that if they could not understand human combat methodology, they should at least study it systematically. The facilities manager resigned, accepted a position at a civilian architectural firm, and reportedly still wakes up at night with anxiety about inadequately secured furniture. Human evolutionary biology, it turned out, was the galaxy's most elaborate long-term prank on every species that had developed actual natural weapons. And the punchline was still unfolding.